"It flies?" said an 8-year-old girl. Everyone froze. My mom dropped her glass, and I just finished my water and stood up. Subscribe if you feel anything. And in the comments, what city are you from? I want to know where you're watching from. The bus rattled over a pothole, jostling me from the lull of my thoughts. Outside, the Atlanta skyline blurred by in streaks of silver and rust, the sun hanging low and thick like a yolk about to burst. I sat near the back, as I always did. Earphones in, but no music playing, just silence. It helped drown out the noise I knew was coming. I was going to the house again, the house with the yellow shutters and the overwatered azaleas, the house that had always been too full of opinions and never full of questions. The family was gathering for Sunday dinner, a ritual as tightly wound and well-rehearsed as a church choir. The kind of gathering where everyone knew their lines, their roles, their jokes. I had mine too. Quiet, polite, background noise. I never liked the way the front gate creaked, like it was groaning in warning, but I stepped through it anyway, boots tapping on the walkway like a countdown. My mother opened the door before I could knock, her lipstick already too red and her smile just a shade too thin. "Well, look what the wind blew in," she said, stepping aside without hugging me. "Wasn't sure you'd show." I offered a nod, not because I was being cold, but because if I said too much, she'd pick apart the tone. She always did. My silence was safer, familiar. The house looked the same. The scent of collard greens and buttered cornbread thickened the air, tangling with lemon-scented furniture polish and nostalgia that had long turned sour. Cousins scattered like marbles around the living room. My older brother Miles was lounging in the recliner, TV remote in hand like a scepter. He spotted me and grinned, that easy, toothy grin that always made people like him without effort. Hey, it's the prodigal introvert," he said. "You still working out there by the airport, scanning baggage or fueling planes or whatever?" I smiled tightly. Still out there. That was the line I always used. Out there. No one ever asked more. It sounded boring enough to kill conversation, which suited me. "You always were into those little gadgets," my mother chimed in from the kitchen, "taking things apart, poking around wires like a squirrel. Thought you'd grow out of it, but here we are." I said nothing. I'd grown into it, just not in the way they imagined. The dining table was dressed like it was expecting royalty. Gold-trimmed plates, 3 kinds of cornbread, ham glistening with glaze, greens swimming in pot liquor. The food was always good. The company, less so. They passed around bowls and judgments with equal ease. Miles launched into a story about his latest training camp, how his coach said he was the most disciplined player he'd seen in years. My other brother Calvin nodded along, chiming in about how his podcast had passed 50,000 downloads, how he was negotiating an ad deal. My mother beamed, one hand on each of their shoulders like they were trophies she'd polished. "And you, baby?" she asked without looking at me, still fiddling with planes. I poured myself a glass of water. Something like that. She smiled the way people do when they think they've figured you out and lost interest. I watched them talk around me, over me, through me. I was used to it. I'd learned early that the less I offered, the easier it was for them to fill in the blanks with their own assumptions. They needed me to be small so their light would feel bigger. So I let them shrink me. For years, they called me bookish as if it were an insult. Quiet, like it was a failing. At school events, when Calvin brought home a medal, they bought balloons. When Miles dunked at the game, there was cake. When I won the state science fair, they asked if I was still eating lunch alone. I used to build airplanes from cereal boxes, tiny fuselages cut with kitchen scissors, wings balanced with toothpicks. I'd line them up under my bed, give them names like Liberty Echo or Bluebird 7. My mother found them once and laughed. "Baby, nobody in this family flies. You better focus on something real." So I did. I focused harder than anyone could see. At 14, I volunteered at the community center to clean the rec room. It paid $20 a week, and every penny went into a coffee can hidden behind the heater in my room. By 16, I was sweeping floors in an aircraft hangar after school, staying late to listen to the mechanics swap stories. I watched how they moved, how they spoke to the machines like old friends. At 17, I took my first introductory flight. The instructor thought I was a tag-along at first, didn't believe the logbook was mine. He changed his mind when I corrected him on crosswind technique midair. He laughed, called me Hawk Eyes. I didn't tell anyone at home. I didn't want to hand them something else to distort. At 18, I got my private pilot's license, took the exam on a Friday morning, and flew solo that afternoon in a weathered Cessna 152 with a stubborn rudder. The wheels lifted off the runway like breath leaving lungs, and for the first time in my life, I felt weightless, not just in the air, but inside. They thought I worked near planes. They never imagined I worked above them. I sat at the dinner table and let Calvin joke about how I must be lugging luggage or cleaning cabins. I let Miles raise his glass to baby sister still in her little world of gadgets. I smiled when they laughed. I didn't defend, not because I was weak, because I was done playing in their echo chamber. When dessert was served, my mother leaned in with a sharp whisper, like she was letting me in on something valuable. You could have been like your brothers, you know, if you just opened up more, had a little fire. I looked at the lemon pie on my plate. Fire doesn't always look like what you're used to. She blinked, then chuckled like I'd said something quaint. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. After dinner, I offered to do the dishes, because that's what they expected. While I stood at the sink, scrubbing plates still warm with grease, I thought about the night before. How I'd landed a jet in thick fog, instruments flickering, a CEO in the backseat sweating bullets. I thought about how I'd pulled off the smoothest landing of my career and stepped out onto the tarmac like a ghost, unseen and uncelebrated. I preferred it that way. The sky didn't clap, it simply opened. When I left the house that night, my mother hugged Calvin and Miles, told them how proud she was. She waved at me from the porch like I was the mail carrier. I walked back to the bus stop in the dark. The streetlights buzzed above me, insects circling in frantic patterns. I thought about how high I'd be flying by morning, 28,000 feet, cruising altitude, that soft hum of the engines beneath your feet, the quiet hum that drowns out everything else. They didn't see me. That was okay, because I saw me, and up there, in that silence, I was loud as thunder. The morning air was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of jet fuel and wet pavement. My boots clicked steadily across the tarmac, each step bringing me closer to the white and gray Citation XLS Plus, parked near Hangar 9. She stood sleek and still in the low light, her engine silent, her body gleaming with early condensation like breath on glass. I always thought she looked like she was holding a secret, something private, mechanical, powerful. Something like me. I checked my watch, 5:42. Sunrise had only begun to flirt with the horizon, staining it in soft rose and burnt orange. Most of the airport still slept. The cargo loaders hadn't arrived. The hangar lights blinked slowly, waking in stages. But I was already here. I was always early. It wasn't a need to impress. It was about control, about readiness, about walking into the belly of something enormous and making it obey. I unzipped my flight bag and pulled out my headset, gloves, and clipboard. The rituals were comforting, the pre-flight checklist a kind of gospel I knew by heart. Static port inspection, pitot tube clear, hydraulic pressure nominal. I moved through it all with quiet precision. I didn't need to think. My body remembered what my mind had rehearsed for years. Inside the cabin, the smell of leather and pressurized air greeted me like an old friend. I ran my fingers over the instrument panel, altimeter, attitude indicator, airspeed, everything where it should be. I buckled in, adjusted the rudder pedals, tested the brakes. My co-pilot arrived 7 minutes later, a guy named Craig who chewed mint gum like it was penance. "Morning, Jay," he said with the kind of familiarity reserved for people who assumed things. I nodded. "Morning." We didn't speak much more than that. Pilots rarely did before a flight. You didn't fill the air with noise when your job was to move through it. The passengers arrived at 6:30. Two lawyers from New York and a woman with perfect posture and a Hermes scarf knotted neatly under her chin. She didn't smile. None of them did. That was typical. They didn't need to know who I was. They only needed to trust that I could get them to Charlotte in one piece, and I would. Takeoff was smooth. The clouds hung low and quiet, a cotton blanket over the morning's edge. The hum of the engines vibrated through my ribs as we climbed. I glanced once at Craig, who had already relaxed into his chair like this was a commuter train. I stayed focused, eyes scanning the horizon, hands light on the controls. Up here, everything made sense. The sky didn't require small talk. It didn't care what my mother thought of me or whether my brothers remembered my birthday. It cared about wind speed, torque, air pressure, angles. It cared about discipline. I was good at that. I was better at that than anything. Somewhere over South Carolina, the turbulence began. Nothing dramatic, just a few jolts sharp enough to make the lights flicker. The woman in the scarf pressed her hand to the armrest. One of the lawyers muttered something about weather patterns. Craig glanced at me. "Want me to—" "I've got it," I said, adjusting our course 3 degrees to the east, eyes steady. We slid out of the chop like a knife through fabric. The plane steadied. The tension evaporated. Craig nodded. "Nice work." I didn't respond. Praise never landed the way people thought it would. Not when it came from people who didn't know what it cost you to get here. My mind drifted, just for a second, to a smaller cockpit, a slower plane, a sky that had felt too big, and a yoke that had once trembled in my hands. I was 18, the first time I flew alone. Not the test flights, not the monitored simulators. Alone. The kind of flight where every breath felt like a commitment and every sound screamed louder than it should. The Cessna was old, with a throttle that stuck if you pushed it too hard and a seatbelt that didn't always lock on the first try. But it lifted. God, it lifted. And so did I. I'd trained in a desert town where the heat clung to you like sweat you couldn't dry. Arizona. Nothing soft about it. The instructors were brisk, the air even more so. I lived in a windowless room above a diner and worked 2 jobs, one loading bags at the local airport, the other cleaning floors at a hangar that smelled like oil and loneliness. I didn't complain. I didn't expect applause. I was there to learn, to endure, to fly. The tests were brutal. The simulator rides were worse. I once threw up in a stairwell after 4 straight hours of emergency procedure drills. But I wiped my mouth, tied my hair back, and went right back in. Because no one was going to do it for me. Because if I failed, they would say, "I told you so." They'd say, "Not built for it." And they would be wrong. By the time I was 19, I could navigate crosswinds, land on ice, communicate with ground control during radio failure. I knew how to stay calm when nothing else was. I knew how to disappear inside focus. That became my armor. After we landed in Charlotte and the passengers disembarked without so much as a glance, Craig clapped me on the shoulder. "Clean work," he said. I nodded again. Then I was gone. That night, I stayed in a hotel with beige curtains and stiff sheets, the kind of place where the AC hummed louder than the TV, and the hallway always smelled faintly of chlorine. I didn't mind. I laid on the bed, eyes tracing the water stains on the ceiling, and thought about Amara. She'd been dropped off 3 months ago when my brother and his wife decided to spend a weekend in Napa. I'd agreed to watch her, not because I wanted to play family, but because I didn't want her to end up babysat by some neighbor who'd ignore her. Amara was 8 and wide-eyed, with a brain that didn't stop moving. She asked questions like she was digging tunnels through the world. That Saturday, I took her to the hangar. It was supposed to be just a walk-through, a quiet tour. But she looked at the jet with such reverence, such wonder, I couldn't help myself. I brought her into the cockpit, let her sit beside me. I showed her the switches, let her wear my spare headset, let her press one button, just one, that made the lights flicker on like stars. She looked at me like I was magic. "You fly this," she'd whispered. "Every week," I told her. She didn't ask why no one knew. She just nodded, like that made perfect sense. That was the only time I'd ever let someone from my family see me at altitude. And she didn't laugh. She didn't minimize. She just saw. Sometimes I wonder if that's all we ever want, to be seen without being adjusted. Back in the hotel, I opened my duffel and pulled out a drawing she'd made, a crayon sketch of a plane with Tia J written in purple across the side. It had bent wings and giant hearts for windows. I kept it with me, tucked between my logbook and my passport. I stared at the ceiling and imagined her face when she saw the cockpit, that pure, sharp moment of belief. Like maybe, just maybe, the world could make space for a girl like her, like me. The next morning, I was already in the air again, flying over the Appalachians, watching the sun crawl over the peaks. I didn't think about my brothers. I didn't think about my mother's voice or her questions shaped like weapons. I thought about lift and balance, about the weight of quiet faith, about the space we make for ourselves when no one else will. And I thought about Amara, sitting beside me, not breathing, not blinking, just watching me move through sky like it belonged to me. Because it did. The invitation came through a group text 2 weeks later. My mother had insisted on a birthday brunch for Grandma Evie, 93 and still sharper than most of the people half her age. It was to be held at the family house, as usual, with a menu that was already color-coded in the message and a thinly veiled directive about what to wear. I stared at the text for a full minute before locking my phone and letting it sit on the counter, untouched, like something I might forget on purpose, but I didn't forget. Amara asked about it that Friday evening when I called to check on her. She was riding home from school in the back of Calvin's car, and I could hear her voice in the background, asking if I was coming. Not pleading, not begging, just asking. Like she already knew the answer she wanted and simply needed me to match it, so I said yes. I don't know why. I'd said no a dozen times before, always under the guise of work or fatigue or flight scheduling. Sometimes true, sometimes not. But this time, something in me didn't resist. Maybe it was Amara. Maybe it was because I was tired of disappearing on cue. Maybe I wanted to see if silence could still hold its shape in a room that fed on noise. The house looked the same as always. Trimmed hedges, over-decorated porch, a chalkboard sign at the door that read, "Welcome back, beautiful family," in swirly letters that made my stomach clench. My mother answered in a sequined blouse and a tone that said, "Hospitality," with just enough edge to remind you she was in control. Her smile barely wavered when she saw me. "Well, there she is. You do remember where we live," she said, and leaned in as though she might kiss my cheek, then didn't. I murmured a hello and handed her the peach cobbler I'd made that morning, not because I wanted to bake, but because she would have commented if I came empty-handed. The gift of not giving them material to work with had become second nature. Inside, the rooms throbbed with conversation. My brothers were already there, holding court with a cluster of cousins. Miles was in the middle of retelling a story about his college football days, complete with sound effects and pantomimed passes. Calvin was recording it on his phone for one of his social media reels, narrating over it like a sportscaster. Laughter flared, rose, dissolved. They were good at this, good at being seen. I hovered near the edge of the kitchen, offering to help plate the biscuits, to stir the greens, to refill water glasses. My mother passed me utensils and tongs without making eye contact, talking to everyone else with that sweet drawl she turned on for guests. Every time I tried to blend into the wall, someone pulled me back with a half-hearted smile or a curious glance that never landed. "You still working around planes?" a neighbor asked me in passing, the kind who always said things like, "Bless your heart," with a smile that never touched their eyes. "Something like that," I said. She nodded, already turning to ask Calvin about his podcast's next big guest. I didn't correct her. I never did. Not because I was afraid. Because explanations to people who already think they know you are like throwing stones into a well with no bottom. The sound never comes back. Amara found me near the piano, where I was pretending to admire the vase of lilies someone had placed there for ambiance. She tugged at my sleeve, all energy and elbows, and grinned up at me. You came. Of course I did, I said. I was afraid you'd get called away to fly some president somewhere, she whispered, conspiratorially. I smiled. She was the only one who said things like that without sarcasm. You remember the switches? I asked. All of them. Even the red one you told me not to touch. Especially that one. We stood there for a few moments, not speaking, until my mother called Amara away to take a family picture by the fireplace. I watched her run off, thinking how small she looked in that big room, how I must have looked the same once, smaller, quieter. Still, brunch unfolded like a play I'd seen too many times, polished, predictable. Grandma Evie made a toast that was half prayer, half reprimand. The food came out in waves. The conversations circled familiar loops, career updates, house renovations, engagements and promotions, and school achievements. I said little. My name passed through a few mouths, but always as a question, what's Jalen up to these days? Still working near planes? Did she ever finish that tech school? They asked as if I weren't sitting right there, as if I were a story told secondhand. At one point, Miles leaned back in his chair and turned to his wife, laughing. Remember that time Jalen took apart the toaster? What were you, like 10? Mom almost had a heart attack when she found it in pieces. Calvin chimed in. Or when she tried to build a rocket in the backyard with soda bottles and a funnel, you couldn't tell her she wasn't going to space. Laughter again. Not cruel, not sharp, just effortless, familiar. I didn't laugh, I didn't flinch. I'd learned not to react. That was my power, invisibility by design. And then it came. The moment I felt coming like the turn of a tide, slow but inevitable. My mother, seated near the center of the room like a queen holding court, lifted her wineglass and smiled. You know, she said to the room at large, Jalen used to get so lost in her little machines. I remember this one time she was maybe 7. She locked herself in the garage trying to wire a light bulb to a battery. We thought she'd set the place on fire. She came out covered in soot and cried for hours. The room chuckled politely. A few heads turned toward me, but most didn't. They didn't need to. The story wasn't for me. It was about me. And then there was the science fair in middle school, Calvin added, emboldened. She froze up so bad she couldn't even talk. Just stood there while her volcano bubbled over. Bless her heart. Always the dramatic one, my mother said, smiling like she'd just offered a sweet compliment. I stared into my water glass, watching the light fracture in the ripples. That's when I saw Amara stand. She was sitting on the floor near the fireplace with a coloring book and a pencil case full of glittery markers. She stood slowly, brushing crumbs off her leggings, and looked around the room like she was checking if anyone else had noticed. "Why are you making fun of Aunt Jalen?" she asked, her voice clear but soft. The laughter stopped, not all at once, but like dominoes slowing down. My mother blinked. "What, baby?" "You're making fun of her, like a joke, but she's not a joke." My father shifted in his seat. Calvin raised an eyebrow. Someone near the window coughed and didn't finish the sound. "She flies airplanes," Amara said. "She took me to the airport. She let me wear the big headphones. She said she flies all over the world." Dead silence. My mother's smile twitched, faltered. "She what?" "She's a pilot," Amara said, like it was obvious. "She showed me the buttons and everything." My cousin Kendra, halfway through a sip of mimosa, paused and looked at me like she'd just realized I was in the room. "You're joking, right?" someone said. I don't know who. It didn't matter. I didn't move. I didn't confirm. I didn't deny. I let it hang there, because truth, when spoken plainly by a child, doesn't need armor. It just is. My mother turned to me, her eyes scanning for something familiar, some version of me she could recognize. Jalen, she started. I met her gaze. Steady? Still. You never asked, I said. Calvin gave a soft, dry chuckle. Damn, you serious? I nodded once. My father scratched his chin, as if trying to remember something he never paid attention to. Well, Aunt Deborah said, too brightly, that's impressive, sweetheart. Not many people do that kind of thing. The table murmured agreement, scattered and half-hearted, but no one met my eyes. They couldn't, because to look at me now would be to admit what they had never seen before. Amara walked over and stood beside me, her small hand grazing my elbow. She didn't say anything else. She didn't have to. She'd already said everything that mattered. For the first time in my life, I was louder without speaking. I caught my mother's eye again. Her expression had changed, not angry, not defensive, just confused, like she was staring at a puzzle with a piece she didn't remember losing. Why didn't you ever tell us? She asked, her voice quiet. I thought about lying, about softening the truth to protect her version of the story, but I didn't, because you never made space to listen. And then I stood. Amara looked up at me. You're leaving? I think I've been here long enough. Her shoulders drooped. I leaned down, close enough so only she could hear. Do you still want to learn what the red switch does? She grinned. Yeah, then maybe. She smiled wider. I ruffled her hair and walked out. No announcement, no explanation, no storming. Just movement. Just air. Behind me, the silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like consequence. I was 37,000 feet above the Atlantic when the morning light started to shift. It wasn't a dramatic sunrise, no bursts of orange or sharp golden flares, just a soft wash of brightness seeping over the curve of the horizon. A quiet offering, the kind that slipped in slowly and didn't ask for acknowledgement, just like I liked it. The cockpit was calm, filled with the gentle hum of systems doing their job. My hands rested lightly on the yoke, my headset secure, my body as still and balanced as the aircraft I guided. Outside, the sky stretched endless and pale, a velvet field of blue turning warmer with every minute. No laughter up here, no sideways glances, no one interrupting me mid-sentence to correct my story or reshape it in their tone. Just sky. Just me. Craig, my co-pilot, was flipping through a checklist beside me, saying something about fuel efficiency on our descent into Lisbon, but I barely registered his voice. I nodded at the appropriate times, eyes scanning the instruments, ears trained to hear the slightest anomaly in the engine's hum. There was nothing. Everything was right. I'd flown this route dozens of times, for clients who never remembered my name but trusted me with their lives. There was something sacred in that trust, silent, invisible, but absolute. The kind of faith that didn't need to be celebrated. It just was. After I left the house that day, I didn't hear from my family. Not immediately. There were no calls, no texts, no follow-up from my mother or brothers or aunts, not even a vague apology buried inside a joke. That, too, was a kind of silence. But it wasn't empty. It was filled with the sound of something shifting, something they hadn't planned for. My absence wasn't a whisper anymore. It had become a presence. They hadn't expected Amara to say what she said. That much had been written on every stunned face. A child had done what none of them ever thought necessary. She looked, she listened, and she told the truth. Not for drama, not for attention, just because it was what she saw. There was nothing to argue with in her voice. It was too pure, too certain. And for people who relied on selective memory and careful retellings, that kind of certainty was dangerous. But I wasn't angry. That part surprised me the most. When I stepped off that porch and walked down the street, past the hedges and the cars and the sidewalks I knew too well, I didn't feel the heat of rage in my chest. I didn't replay old wounds or script clever comebacks. I felt clear, weightless, like I'd just released something I'd been gripping too long. There's a moment at takeoff, when the engines roar and the ground trembles, that your body braces, expecting the worst. But then comes the lift, that second when you rise, and the world below shrinks and softens, and the weight you've carried no longer matters. That's what it felt like to walk away from that house. And now, up here, above cloud and consequence, I wasn't replaying their silence. I was listening to my own. It had taken years to learn the difference between being invisible and being private, between hiding and choosing not to explain. I used to think they were the same, that if I didn't speak up, I was erasing myself, that if I didn't correct their assumptions, I was letting them define me. But the truth was quieter and harder. I wasn't erasing, I was protecting. I was building something real in the spaces they left unattended. They didn't see me, because they never looked, not really. They saw the version they liked, the one who stayed quiet at dinner, the one who helped clean up, the one who didn't argue when they made jokes at her expense, the helper, the afterthought, the background. But Amara saw me. She sat beside me in that cockpit, her little legs swinging, her face half hidden by the headset, and she watched. Not like someone watching a show. Like someone witnessing something she knew she wanted to understand. She asked smart questions. She listened with her whole body, and when I answered, she didn't look surprised, just proud. That moment, her watching me take off, her fingers hovering near the switches, her voice in my headset saying, "This is so cool," meant more than anything my family had ever said. Because she didn't need me to be smaller to feel big. She didn't flinch when I showed her what I could do. She just saw it and smiled. That was all I needed. Craig handed me a report. I signed off on the landing path and gave him the nod. We began our descent, the clouds thickening below like dense wool. Lisbon glimmered faintly on the edge of vision, a soft scatter of lights waking up beneath the morning haze. I could already feel the difference in air pressure, the subtle shift of the aircraft as we aligned for approach. I ran through my mental checklist, cleared the flaps, adjusted throttle, and felt the aircraft respond beneath my fingertips like a well-trained partner. My body moved on instinct. No panic, no doubt, just knowledge and repetition and trust. We landed smoothly. The wheels touched down with barely a bump. The brakes hissed gently, and we taxied toward the terminal like ghosts returning to Earth. The passengers didn't look back as they disembarked. They never did. That wasn't the point. After shutdown, I walked out onto the tarmac. The breeze off the water was cool against my neck. I looked up at the sky that had just held me, that always held me, and I breathed. Later, in the hotel room, I sat on the edge of the bed with a cup of tea and pulled out the folded paper I always carried in my flight bag. Amara's drawing. A plane, colored in with purples and blues, hearts for windows, a crooked little girl drawn in the cockpit.